Excellent. All right. So maybe I'll just kick off because we have got a lot to get through. So thank you everybody for joining us today for this interactive session on the post-pandemic workforce, restructuring, upskilling and redeployment in 2021. I'm Anya Clark and I'm the Investor Engagement Manager for the WDI. I'm so pleased and excited to be joined by three veritable experts in the world of work, all of whom can offer very unique insights and perspective on this topic. Christy Hoffman, General Secretary of Uni Global Union, Anna Maybank, founder and CEO of Breakroom, and Helen Shepherd, Global Corporate Responsibility and Inclusion Manager at RELX. So thank you so much all for joining me today. So this is an interactive session where the panel will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes before we open it up to the floor for a wider and more in-depth discussion, Q&A, general comments and feedback. If you'd like to make a point at any point, please raise your hand or write it in the chat box. You can also interject at any point and we'll seek to answer questions as we go. If you are staying in a more listen-only mode for this session, you can just turn your camera off. But if you want to participate more actively, then please turn your camera on and yeah, we can see you and your organization as well if you would like to change the name on the Zoom meeting. So this is an open space and we want it to be comfortable for all, regardless of experience. So please be respectful of others and engage with understanding. We encourage you to listen to perspectives shared by others and to learn from these. We're mindful that most people may be at home and interruptions might happen from children and pets, etc. And that is okay. If you need to leave the session for a moment, just step away from your computer. Yeah, please just simply do so. My wonderful colleague, Rosie McKenzie, and also James Caldwell, who I see on this call, will be on hand to answer any technical issues. So if you experience any difficulties, please contact them and yeah, they will be able to help. So before I jump into the discussion with our speakers, I just wanted to briefly outline and provide some context to the issues that we will be covering in today's session. So just over a year ago, the WHO declared the coronavirus a global pandemic. While first and foremost a global health concern, the ensuing economic turbulence and recessions have had a huge and lasting impact on the world of work and the shape and the face of its workforce. While existing workforce inequalities and insecurities have undoubtedly been exacerbated throughout the past year, businesses have also innovated to stave off the threat of mass redundancies and maintain the health and well-being of their workers. To capture this unprecedented moment, in 2020, the WDI survey asked companies questions on how they were protecting and supporting their workers during COVID-19 and whether there were any changes in turnover expected as a result. The results were reassuring. Overall, companies seem to recognize effective workforce management as being crucial to both how companies immediately responded to the pandemic and how they approached the recovery. And there were generally good levels of data across most questions about COVID-19. For example, 88% of companies explained their approach to workforce, supply chain, and business resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. 87% outlined the steps the company had taken to protect the physical and mental health of their workforce. And 79% explained measures that had been implemented to ensure workers take sick leave and are protected economically if they do so. Individual responses cited adopting flexible working arrangements, giving employees allowances to buy equipment to support their well-being whilst working from home, the expansion of employee assistance and well-being programs to ensure all employees have access to confidential expert counselling and advice, and while in the office, social distancing measures were introduced alongside enhanced cleaning and PPE. However, there is still ambiguity when it comes to the implementation of certain COVID measures and crucially, which workers were covered by these measures. In terms of turnover data, only a third of responders reported this data and just 18% of companies had turnover data for both permanent and temporary employees. So there is still a disconnect between what workforce data companies have and are willing to report and their policies and practices that they are looking to implement. And so with that in mind, I will turn over to the panel to introduce themselves briefly. And maybe I'll start with Christy. So just a note, when we initially spoke about this topic for the workforce, I suggested a focus on responsible redundancies during COVID-19. However, you felt that there was a more optimistic story to tell. And so I guess my first question is to you. How have you seen companies react to the pandemic in terms of changes to their workforce?
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation to join you today. Just to say, Uni Global Union, we represent more than 20 million workers in 150 countries in various sectors across the services industries. And in our sectors, we've seen such a wide range of situations because the pandemic had a dramatic impact in, let's say, media and entertainment, where the cultural side is still not open. We see film production resuming, but really shut down. But then we look at the sectors like retail and care, food retail in particular, which stayed open during the pandemic. We relied upon these workers as our essential workers, caregivers as well. We have sports, we have workers in the professional athletes who were unable to play for some period. And I think through all of this, we learned that we've seen remote work, of course, on a grand scale, but also about half of our workers stayed working throughout the pandemic. We do now hear some discussion about restructuring, which in general terms means some reduction, let's say, in bank branches, moving some of the customer service work to call centers, outsourcing, and so on. So there's a lot going on. Not so much redundancies, I must say, but big changes. And we see also the need for big changes. For example, with the essential workers, we talked about them and clapped for them and so on, but we need to put it into practice that these essential workers need to be revalued, and their future needs to be built on a foundation of them having a voice. Obviously, we support they should have a voice through a trade union. We have seen the importance of social dialogue throughout the pandemic. We've been working with with employers on remote work. In fact, we just issued key principles on remote work not so long ago, because we see that this will, in fact, be a big trend in the future. And there are many, many red flags for workers that need to be addressed. We also worked with employers on responding responsibly regarding health and safety. We had a joint declaration with a number of big retailers like Auchan, Carrefour, Casino Group, and others. And today we're announcing a set of standards for investors around poor practices in nursing homes and how we can address that through adopting sector-wide standards. So we see opportunity to address some of the big problems that became glaring during the pandemic. And also we've seen the value of very deep and focused social dialogue on negotiating return to work protocols, and of course on restructuring. So I think in all three of those, we see those dimensions. We're not really seeing the redundancies in our sector, but we are seeing the need to have good social dialogue across the other areas.
And I know you have a lot to say on key workers and how they should be revalued in the Building Back Better manifesto. But I might just jump to Helen first to give your perspective, from the corporate side of things, about how the pandemic has affected your work and business operations.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. And again, delighted to be here. It's a really great opportunity, I think, for us as a business to talk about what we've been doing. For those that don't know, RELX is probably one of the biggest companies in the FTSE that no one's ever heard of. So we are a FTSE 100 company listed and headquartered in the UK. We are a global data analytics and information business with 33,000 employees across about 40 countries. globally. And we have products and services in different markets, including the academic market, the legal market, the risk and fraud prevention markets, as well as a global exhibitions business, which I think is fair to say suffered the most during the pandemic. So as a business that is organizing face-to-face large exhibitions around the world, those didn't halt completely, but were just, most of them were not able to take place last year, understandably, given the pandemic. And that had a massive impact on that particular business. I think also as a company, we had to, like many businesses, think about the safety of our own employees. And within, as the pandemic was spreading around the world, we quickly responded in being able to, and we were lucky in that respect, that our employees were able to work from home. So we had, I think at the height of the pandemic, 94% of our employees were working from home across the world. And I think that as, the nature of our business, we were lucky in that we were able to, we didn't have to shut down apart from the exhibitions, but we were able to kind of adapt quite quickly in that respect. But we recognize that home working comes with its own impact, I think, on people's mental health. So I know for a lot of people, they're working at home, trying, in many cases with their children at home as well. And sometimes in, apartments or buildings that just aren't designed for them to be working at home. So trying to find ways to support our employees whilst they're working from home, we had a big emphasis, and we continue to do so, on mental well-being and mental health. We provided employees with additional time off. So we gave everyone an extra day off last year of annual leave. We also kind of listened to our employees. We have a really vibrant community engagement program across the business where employees can volunteer. And clearly charities were impacted by the pandemic, but also communities were as well. And we heard from our employees that they still wanted to use their volunteer time. So we relaxed the rules around how people could volunteer. And so people were able to volunteer by, if not necessarily directly with a registered charity, if they wanted to volunteer by going to, run errands for a neighbor who is isolating, they could do that. And there are a number of kind of examples where employees were doing that. We also, going back to the exhibitions business, redeployed one of our venues. So most of the venues we use third-party venues, but we do have our own venue in Austria, which we redeployed as a field hospital, and it had over 3,000 beds. And then just kind of touching on the exhibitions business, which, given the impact the pandemic has had, we have gone through a restructuring process in that business. It wasn't taken lightly, and I think the impacts could have been worse if it was not part of this other, this wider group where, the other three businesses in that group have continued relatively successfully through the pandemic. And also, I think that's been a benefit. So where possible, we've looked for opportunities for our employees to be redeployed in other parts of the business. So there are people who have skills, marketing, technology that could potentially be redeployed in some other sister businesses within RELX. So we've always kind of looked at those opportunities. And actually, interestingly, when we look at turnover data, despite the pandemic, our turnover figures are much lower last year than previous years. And I think that maybe reflects potentially the fact that people feel secure in their jobs at the moment here in Relics and are not looking to move elsewhere at the moment. I mean, given maybe the insecurity in other jobs, you know. So that was something that's quite interesting about our business.
Thanks, Helen. And I might just get Anna to jump in and give her very unique perspective on this topic.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here today. So just a little bit of background on Breakroom, because we're a company that's only about a year old. So we started just before the pandemic happened. So it's been an interesting year. So Breakroom is the people-powered job comparison site for frontline workers. So the simple way of understanding what we do is where the WDI goes to companies and asks, from a top-down level, how do you treat your workforce, and what principles and processes have you got in place to support them? We are trying to crowdsource that data from workers themselves. And the workers that we are specifically focused on are on the front line. So they are typically all hourly paid and shift workers. And that means that a large proportion, but not all, are quite low paid. So a lot of the people who've actually running the country for the last year. And there are also people who don't always have so much power in the workplace, right? Partly because they're low paid and often undervalued. So the way Breakroom works is that we've designed a survey that was based on a lot of research that we did with workers and employers about what a good job looked like. We've created a survey that covers pay, hours, benefits in the workplace, and how you're treated in the workplace. And we ask workers 30 questions about their personal experience of work. And those workers are finding us either through social media or as part of their job search, if they're looking to switch jobs. And that survey data is collected based on them comparing their jobs on the Breakroom site. We've had about 100,000, more than 100,000 UK workers use Breakroom to compare their jobs in the last year. But most of that data actually comes from the last 6 months, where we've pretty much tripled the number of people who've used Breakroom since October. And to give you, I can pull out a few findings that we've had, because bear in mind, like, this is all data during the pandemic. We actually, because of the fact that we're new, we don't have pre-pandemic information. I think so. I pulled out a few things that show what companies are really not doing very well according to their workers. And the one that really sticks out is that people say that actually head office do not understand what is going on the front line. So 70% of people say that head office don't understand what happens in their day-to-day working lives. And I think, you know, that's kind of part of the gap that we're trying to fill at Breakroom. We're trying to help companies understand that and give workers a voice in a new way. I also bottom of the rankings is stuff like lack of sick pay. So 50% of people saying that they're not getting more than statutory sick pay, which is obviously a big problem over the course of the last year. And another thing which I'll talk about in a bit more detail is that just very little notice of shift patterns and when you're working. So 30% of people are getting less than a week's notice of when they work. And that there's actually a whole bunch of stuff about hours and shifts that sounds trivial, but is so important if you're on the front line trying to manage. You know, we've if you're an office worker, actually, you know, anecdotally spoken to people who find that working from home has given more flexibility, and the pandemic has opened new ways of working. But actually that's not happening for frontline staff in the same way. And I think there's some really simple things that companies could be doing to make big changes around hours and shift patterns. And then the final thing is that people are very stressed. So more than 60% of our users have said that they are often stressed at work. And there are lots of reasons for that we could dig into in the rest of our findings, but that I think that one of which actually is that 35% of our users aren't paid enough to live on. So we work out that based on the Real Living Wage Foundation's data or benchmarks for what you should be paid per hour. So like, there are some big problems for this workforce. I suspect a lot of those existed before the pandemic. There's also, I don't want to dig into kind of other data, but just to kind of flag a few one interesting thing is that we are seeing that some sectors overall perform a bit better. So like transport and manufacturing get better break room ratings overall. Hospitality often at the bottom of the pile. But also within one industry, there's quite a lot of difference. So taking retail as an example, Ocado doing pretty well on the break room scale, whereas something like B&M or McColl's are right down there at the bottom of our break room rating. And if you look into kind of why that is based on the data that we've collected, it's a lot of the things that I've just talked about in terms of, you know, whether head office know what's going on, lack of sick pay, lack of paid breaks, shift patterns and stress, and happy to dig into more of that in this session, but I think the work that we have done over the last year, I think, highlights how far some companies have to go in terms of how they treat their frontline workforce.
Thanks, Anna. And if anybody wants to jump in at this point, please do raise your hand. Again, this is meant to be an interactive session. So, you know, if you have any points for or questions for the panel, please do let us know. But Chrissy, I just want to ask you about if you have any reflections of that in particular. I know you've worked a lot with companies on good practice. And is this the kind of thing you're seeing within the sectors that you're working with as well?
But let me just respond a little bit to the last comment as well, Helen's comment about the issues that really stress workers out, because we obviously find that in our sectors as well. We think that workers having a voice, having an organized voice through a union is actually like key to addressing some of these issues. But in terms of the not having notice of breaks, that's such a huge issue, you know, for workers. I agree, in the front lines, especially when you get to low wage retail and care, because the algorithmic management is like, we just want to call you if we need you, and we don't know whether we're going to need you next Thursday afternoon, depending on what the algorithm predicts, and so on, predictive kind of retail needs. And that's a huge issue in terms of people managing their lives, their childcare, their transport, and all the rest. So I agree with you, that's a big issue, and it needs to be really, it needs to be addressed in order to make these jobs good jobs. In terms of what we've, you know, seen, some employers do far better than others, as I said. I mean, but you know, some employers have had really rapid growth during the pandemic period, especially in technology, in e-commerce, in customer service, in call centers, and those who have social dialogue, who have bargaining, can do that responsibly. We've seen a lot of examples of quick expansion without any social dialogue. I mean, Amazon is one example where we've seen the brutality of the working methods in e-commerce, the pace of work becoming unbearable. Frankly, call centers, we're seeing many call center workers being moved to home, which is, you know, responsible thing to do in a context of COVID, but that has been accompanied with full-time cameras in the home. And that's something that we have to think about: people's privacy rights, their, you know, the rights to not be monitored every second of the day. That's looming on the horizon, I think, as a big issue around the use of technology and responsible working at home. Does that mean that you have to be monitored, you know, for your entire workday, which means putting a camera often, you know, in your bedroom, in your private space? These are often low wage workers who don't have a private office in their home. So we've seen a lot of, you know, wide disparities in terms of treatment of workers and these new problems that come up. As I said, you know, the monitoring is going to be a huge issue, monitoring not only cameras, but how many keystrokes you take and so on. So, you know, this all involves having some social dialogue and bargaining over some of these key issues. We just launched last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, a joint declaration on AI for the insurance sector, because this artificial intelligence is really having a big impact on their jobs. And so how do we reskill? How do we upskill? How do we deploy that technology responsibly? So yeah, it's a very interesting time, important time when we talk about just transition. for technology, just transition, of course, also for a green economy. And then some of the basic issues that were there all along. Some of these low-wage workers were badly treated pre-COVID, and they're going to be badly treated post-COVID unless we can get our head around the fact that we rely upon these frontline workers for our survival, as we did during COVID, and we need to give them ensure that they can have a better life.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree. Helen, maybe I'll just get you to come in here from the company perspective. And there's been quite a lot of, talk in from the last couple of minutes about employee social dialogue, and just wondering, how you perceive the dynamic between, managers and workers, and how the chain of accountability kind of enables decision making at RELX, or does it, or is this an issue that you've been thinking about and talking about, within your organization as well?
Yeah, and actually, thanks, Christy, for mentioning the joint declaration on AI, because that's definitely something I'll look up following this session. As a data business, and thinking about our human rights impact as a business, we traditionally have looked at our supply chain, a little bit about our own operations, but more recently thinking about our products and services, which we recognize, these are tools that may help insurance companies make decisions. Ultimately, governments are using them to provide benefits for people. So there are potentially some quite big impacts that our technologies can be having on people's lives. And we, over the past year, 18 months, have been thinking about how, the ethical impacts of our AI, and trying to develop some principles and some tools to help those, I guess, data scientists and computer scientists develop those tools responsibly. It's a bit of a work in progress, but I just wanted to mention that, and I'd be very interested to look up your declaration, because we're always looking to learn on this topic. Coming back to social dialogue, it's really important for us to engage with our employees. It's not always easy to do. And we have formal channels. We have a reporting line as well, as our employee works councils. We also have informal channels. I think sometimes these are just as effective. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matters movement actually last year, where during the pandemic, our colleagues were faced with the atrocities that were happening in the US, of Black people being killed, and it actually created this huge movement, obviously globally, but within our own business, we have 50% of our employees almost based in the US. And there was a lot of pain felt by employees at that time. And that pain was kind of shared by employees globally. So we saw the movement kind of spreading to our offices people were still at home, but across Europe and in Asia as well. And, people, and particularly our Black colleagues, but also, it was everyone, wanted their voices to be heard, and wanted our leaders to recognize that racial injustice was something that was happening. And the CEOs listened, and we set up this dialogue for the leaders of our employee resource groups, of our ethnic minority groups, to have a meeting, but not just one meeting. It was regular meetings with our 4 CEOs of our businesses. And they put together an action plan, and they said to the CEOs, well, these are the 5 things that we want you to do. And the CEOs listened, and they said, okay, we take that on board, and we're going to do this. And what was really interesting, because that was one of the first times, I think, where because of a social movement happening outside of the company, had given voice to our employees, and there was kind of this recognition that there was a lot of pain felt by workers, and the CEOs wanted to take action. And we've seen now, one of the things that our employees asked for was additional time off to get involved in events that relate to inclusion and diversity. So now employees are given that kind of 2 days paid time to do that. They wanted us to sign up to something called the Business and the Community Race at Work Charter, which commits us to be transparent about our data relating to ethnic minorities, but also, it sets out some other initiatives that we should be taking in relation to progression and development, and also recruitment of Black people and Asian and other ethnic minority people. So I think that was really interesting, because it basically catapulted this issue that, for a long time our employees had been talking about it. We've been wondering what to do. It was a topic that was difficult to address. And it brought it to the attention very quickly of our leaders. And following that, we've held sessions that we call the Courageous Conversations. They've been happening across our business. There's small groups of people that they're facilitated. They basically follow, there's a book, it's called What If, and it's by Dr. Stephen Gibbons, and it shares case studies. But these case studies are designed to get people talking about topics that, that are sensitive, that are perhaps difficult. And we've since last summer held about 1,500 of these sessions, these courageous conversations for employees to have a voice. And so I think that, well, who knows whether this would have happened despite, if there had been no pandemic, if there had been no kind of Black Lives Matter movement. But I think it's just been really important for us to have these informal channels for employees to kind of get their voice heard.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Anna, you mentioned, bringing in the kind of the diversity element of things. You mentioned to me in one of the briefing calls that one of the worst, one of the jobs that fared the least well in terms of employee perspective or evaluation through the survey were midwives. And maybe you could just, I guess, give your own insights on that particular issue, or and how gender plays a role in this debate as well.
Yeah, certainly. I think so. One of the things to say is we actually don't collect yet diversity data, but one of the things that we're looking to do as we grow is to start asking people who take the survey about their backgrounds, and what we will then be able to do is show which companies' break room ratings are most different depending on gender or race, for example, and that's kind of a different way of reporting potentially on the gender gap, the gender pay gap, also the diversity pay gap. We haven't done that work yet, but I think there's huge potential to be able to say, well, Ocado scores this on the break room rating across the board, but actually it's scoring this for women, or this for people from ethnic minorities. So specifically on the data that we currently have, this is a what Anya and I were talking about was a somewhat anecdotal finding, but it is, if you look at our occupation, so we take individual ratings that people get, and we aggregate them into occupation ratings as well. So we also rate different occupations separate from our company ratings. And top of the list at the moment is train drivers, and one of the bottom is midwives. And I think if you look through those occupation break room ratings, there is a clear gender divide, where retail, care, and care adjacent professions, so nursing and midwifery, are scoring more poorly. I think there are probably a range of reasons for that. So one is, I think there is, so this is currently anecdotal, but I think there is some evidence that in industries where there's been a history of collective bargaining, they tend to be more male dominated, and they are in some instances scoring better. I also think that there is a degree to which women are still doing the bulk of the childcare, right? And that leads them to take certain jobs that are available to them. Often those jobs are in, like retail is actually a really good example, because retail fits around school very easily. And retail does particularly badly on the pay front. Also retail, so Christy mentioned the sort of move towards scheduling that's sort of automated. I think that's a complete con for companies actually, as well as for workers. I think companies are being oversold a technology solution that is meant to make their workforce more productive and efficient. It just doesn't. But I think it's those kind of industries that there are a lot of women working as well. And I think there are a combination of things that seem to be suggesting from our early data that if you are female, you are getting a worse deal at work. And that's something that yeah, as I've said, there are a range of reasons for that. Obviously, we don't collect data on race, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was a similar.
Yeah. I wonder, does any of the panel want to come in on that, or any of the points that Anna just mentioned?
Well, I could just echo that. I mean, it's very clear from the data that the frontline workers who were female were concentrated in the low wage jobs. Predominantly the frontline key, whatever the workers, we use the word essential workers, are predominantly female. And those are the jobs. There's a gender gap, there's gender segregation, and particularly in retail, particularly in low wage care, in social care, what you use the word social care. In the UK, we might call them nursing homes, but that is over 80% women. I think it might even be in the 90s women, and workers earning very close to the minimum wage with not full-time hours, many having 2 and 3 jobs. So, and that it's very gender segregated. So there is a gender dimension to this, which is part of the reason why we say some of these essential jobs need to be revalued. And that needs to be accompanied by collective bargaining, because we don't really see the revaluing happening without having collective bargaining. And as you say, the transport workers, the postal workers, we also represent postal workers. They were essential. They worked during the pandemic. They are traditionally more heavily male, although post is shifting a bit right now, more heavily male, but they have a strong collective bargaining tradition, and they've been able to the postal workers have done an excellent job of getting through the pandemic with minimum health and safety risk to the workers, and just managing it really well. And I have to say that the postal unions have done an excellent job. But where you see workers without a voice, without a power at work, without a collective framework, they're the ones who've suffered the most, and that's what we need to change.
And if it's okay, Anya, I just wanted to maybe touch on some of the points that my colleagues have made on the panel around gender and I guess diversity. Last year the pandemic saw an increase in gender-based violence. Women were just, the violence against women increased as a result of the pandemic. Domestic violence increased, and as a business, we wanted to see what we could do. And so our South Africa business, actually our legal business in South Africa, has made tools available through a gender-based violence resource center, and have held a number of kind of awareness days to try and support women through their partnerships. And we've also, I think, recognizing the diversity in nursing. Our Elsevier business, which is our science and medical business, has started trying to fund nursing scholarships for ethnic minorities in the US. So there are some programs that we've started to introduce to try and address these disparities using kind of our tools and services.
Thank you so much for filling us in, Helen. And another question is that I had is what are the kind of the challenges that come with kind of more extensive social dialogue between board members and employees? I mean, it's not an easy. I guess it's not an easy way to kind of conduct business operations, or certainly seemingly so. I mean, it adds a layer of complexity. But if you could kind of fill us in on what those challenges are, and some of the opportunities maybe as well that come along with kind of having more worker voice in the organization.
So we have a board member who is designated as kind of the workforce, I'm not sure the exact title, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but the workforce relations, it's in her remit. And pre-pandemic, she was responsible for, or we wanted her to hear worker voice. And so there were opportunities created where she could speak to workers, not just in the UK or in the Netherlands where she's based, but from all parts of the globe. And she worked very closely with our Chief Human Resources Officer in that, because essentially, ultimately, what we wanted was not only to kind of raise the issues that employees felt were important to board recognition, but also for our HR officer to develop strategies to address some of these issues. I'm actually not sure whether these have continued recently. We kind of have a temporary HR officer at the moment. So I think currently there's a pause in some of that activity, but it's definitely a priority for the board. And I think, we as a business, our people are our business. And so making sure that our employees are happy, that they have voice is critical. And that we're not just listening to them, but I think responding to them. So I think it's just one thing to create that environment where employees can be heard. I think it's also important to actually be seen to be addressing those issues that are important to employees. And then the other thing is that our supply chain is very diverse and very vast, and we take our responsibility to the workers in our supply chain very importantly. It's very important that the workers in our supply chain are also treated fairly. So, but it's much harder to engage in dialogue with workers in the supply chain. And so I think that's an area that we can do better, and that we need to think about how we're engaging with our supply chain and our suppliers on some of these topics. We've identified some issues that we want to create more dialogue with our suppliers around. These are issues that come up in the audits that we conduct in high-risk countries. Some of these issues are around low wages and working hours. So we're trying to see how we can better support suppliers on those topics. We're hoping to run an ethical supplier conference, which is very much around education and awareness raising later in the year. But it's not easy, and I think that definitely an evolving journey for us in terms of kind of that engagement piece.
Does anybody else want to come in on that point? No. Great. Yeah. I guess, Christy, I have a question in terms of leading practice that you're seeing on social dialogue, and particularly within supply chains as well. If you could shed some light on that for us, or even just within the sectors that you're working on.
Well, in terms of social dialogue in our sectors, well, let me say in terms of supply chains, there's a couple of things. One is we consider the call centers to be in the supply chain because they're part of the value chain, they're part of the outsourced work. We have a lot of workers who are actually working in outsourced industries, cleaning and security and so on. And they do tend to get less attention from some of these big tech companies. For example, they treat their direct employees far better than they do the outsourced workers who are, wherever they are in the world. But certainly it's in a less expensive country to operate than where they locate their head office, almost always. And so it's a battle because the outsourced companies will fight really hard to remain non-union and not to have a collective bargaining. I focused, more on call centers a minute ago, but I think it's a huge and growing business of workers who have almost never any voice on the job. Occasionally we have unions in some countries. There was just recently a big strike among call center workers in Tunisia, Morocco. But I think, it's just a fact that workers having a voice, they're going to elevate the jobs. We saw some terrible treatment, retaliation against workers during COVID who spoke out about health and safety. And that tended to be in those industries which were non-union, where they said, look, this is dangerous. We're all crowded in here. We're sharing headsets. Whatever the particular issue might be, but we did see quite a few workers dismissed because they spoke out. And I think that should never happen. And, also, in the supply chain, we've seen the women producing garments for the big brands. That's gotten a lot of attention in certainly in the British press, but elsewhere as well, that they were, many of them lost their jobs. So that's a whole nother story of brands not paying some of their orders and just, suddenly dropping the orders. The stores were closed, and we're still working on that, trying to recover, that severance pay that was owed to these millions of garment workers across Asia. But we don't find that the issue of social dialogue is not limited to the supply chain. I mean, when we're looking at care workers, as I said, we're launching today a big statement from investors and one of the questions in the chat is, what are the recommendations for investors to look at? Because investors also have due diligence responsibilities to ensure that the rights of their workers are respected. We think, just looking at care, for example, we're launching a statement jointly signed by 90 investors today to say that we're going to consider care homes should be considered a high risk industry. It was the most dangerous occupation during COVID is to work in a care home. 500,000 care home workers in the United States became infected with COVID. And that's just one country, and the numbers would replicate across the rest of Europe for sure. So what can we do about lifting up the standards? We have to take responsibility as investors would do in a high risk industry to look at what are the criteria we should look for, what are the criteria we should demand or require, encourage our portfolio companies to adopt. And there's, key elements that, yes, they should have social dialogue, they should have collective bargaining, but other as well. They should be paid a living wage. They should have regular hours. We should look for indicators like, what is the turnover of workers? What is the job retention? Because that's a feature when it comes to care. It's linked to the quality of care. what are the staffing ratios? That's linked to the quality of care, because we need to have if we want to have sustainable industry, it has to be good for both patients, the residents, as well as the workers. And their two issues are very closely linked to one another, because where you have better worker conditions, you have better care. And so this is something that we think investors should be engaged in, and they have been. I mean, as I said, we're launching our big statement today, sign-on declaration, that in the future we will start to look very closely at this industry and how we can systematically and sector-wide, and not just focusing on one particular employer or another, but because these problems are pervasive across the industry. And I think that was sort of the scandal among the developed countries, is that on average 30% of the deaths were in nursing homes. How many of those would have been preventable had we had better conditions for workers and less transmission between staff and clients, and better staff patient ratios and so on. So yeah, I think there's a lot for investors to do. And I think, let's be honest, that unless we can, sort of lift the bottom at the same time as that we're building out our middle in terms of the income brackets and status of our workers, we don't start to address the inequality that we face, which has become ever more prominent, ever more, a feature of our lives during COVID, with the, sort of big winners and losers.
Yeah, I totally agree. And maybe this is a good point to kind of segue to the, disclosure and reporting side of the debate, because I know we're both working at this from two different perspectives, but ultimately to achieve the same goal, and that's to kind of, get more transparency around workforce practices and policies. And so I guess it would be good to get your insight on, why reporting on these issues is important, and particularly, I guess, why you founded Breakroom in the first place, to kind of get the real information, the real data about what's going on for workers behind the scenes. So I wonder if I could just get your kind of remarks on that.
Yeah, totally. So I think it's brilliant that the WDI is attacking this problem from a board level. People like Christy and the union movement are attacking this problem from one route of kind of grassroots activity, and we're bringing a new thing to the table. I think we all need all of these things together, right? And one of the things that I think we have been trying to do at Breakroom is be a voice that, or give workers a voice in a way that they maybe wouldn't feel comfortable in the workplace claiming. We're trying to make a whole bunch of information more transparent, make it very Googleable, frankly, because the internet is a very powerful force for shedding light on things that are otherwise hard to find out. But I think I think we need lots of different ways of collecting this information, and I think the part of the inspiration for starting Breakroom was really that I guess I'd be counted as a knowledge worker because I spent the majority of my career working in an office, and for us, things like Glassdoor, for example, become very standard ways that workers swap information about what a job is really like. And basically myself and my co-founders realized that actually there's a huge proportion of the population that I didn't work for. And also there are a whole bunch of problems with the way Glassdoor collects information and data. And we realized that there was a huge opportunity to give people who are traditionally less powerful in the workplace, who are these frontline, typically lower paid workers, to give them a voice in the way that Glassdoor and other forums have given sort of more privileged workers a voice. But in order to do that, we had to have a really strong opinion about what good work is, because ultimately, I know people have tried to use Glassdoor data to to enhance, to make investment decisions. But the problem with it is it's quite biased. So like, what does 1 to 5 stars really mean? Companies can also pay to hide reviews. What does that mean? And what we're trying to do is create an objective standard for using worker information to rate employers. And that standard comes from, you know, being able to ask very specific questions. So all of the questions in the break room survey are things like, you know, do you ever worry about getting enough hours, for example? Or are you always able to take breaks? And all of those things come together into an aggregate score, which is, we think, gives a more unbiased and objective voice to the worker experience, which is a bit different from the voice that you get from being in a union, which is also super important, or the kind of the top-down approach of what a company wants to implement. Because I think we're all aware that like wanting to implement something and actually it working on the ground are two slightly different things. And so we're kind of trying to measure that as well. So I think it's super exciting that there are more people trying to tackle this. And I think this is the perfect moment for the ESG space to really start thinking about the S. I know there's going to be a panel later on today about this, but like traditionally that's been very much about measuring environmental impact, right? And we've struggled to measure the worker piece of that. And I think that's what we're all trying to do here. And it's really exciting that there are more people trying to tackle that from in more ways, because I don't think there's ever going to be one solution, right? We kind of need it all.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Helen, I might just go to you for a word and perspective from a company's perspective on workforce reporting.
Yeah, I think so. I sit in the corporate responsibility team, and we want to be transparent about our data. We want to be, you know, telling our story externally. We sometimes have to lobby internally to be able to do that. And we find it helpful. The Workforce Disclosure Initiative, Share Action, are all really helpful in giving us leverage to be able to be more transparent, and the investor voice, I think, as well, definitely gives us more leverage to be able to be more transparent. I think that there's a fine line between too much reporting and kind of the focus is only on reporting, and then you spend less time on the doing. And I think that we do struggle with lots of reporting. It's difficult to balance this kind of need to be constantly disclosing. There are a number of indices that we participate in throughout the year: the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, the Workforce Disclosure Initiative. That's just kind of a handful of the ones that I can think of, on top of kind of customer requests and investor requests that come to us outside of those requests. So we definitely want to be transparent. We try and put as much as we can in our corporate responsibility report, which again is another big reporting process for us. And I think it's just trying to find that balance of like, what can we put in the public domain? What's the business happy for us to put in the public domain? And also, just not being constantly reporting for the sake of reporting. But, we're a data-driven business. Data is important to us.
Thank you, Helen. Christy, do you have any maybe 30-second final remarks?
Yeah.
We'll close the session.
Yeah, so I think this whole question on disclosure, look, we believe that you've got to measure what matters, but we think what's missing from the disclosure initiatives, not necessarily, as a package, the benchmarking and so on, the indicators, there are some good benchmarks in terms of gender equality and disclosing, gender pay gaps and so on. We think added to that should be disclosing what percentage of your workers are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And we need to start taking a closer look at that factor. I realize many employers would fail that test, would say 0. and some who hold themselves out as being very, very much, very friendly to collective bargaining would indeed have a smaller percentage than you think when it comes to countries where that's not normal or that's not the norm. I think when you look at some of the lesser, in UK would probably fall into that bucket of not being as certainly as high as other countries in Europe, and as well as, let's say, Poland, for example, where it's very, very low. And so we want to look at some really big multinationals that we deal with in particular and start going deeper with that data. And we think that's an important piece of data that should be disclosed, and it should be embedded in all the various metrics that are being looked at and the models and frameworks that are being adopted in this ESG space.
Thanks, Christy. And thank you to all the panelists. We are just a minute over time. Yeah, we'll take a break for lunch now and reconvene back at 2 p.m. UK time for the main panel discussion, which is reporting on the S of ESG from shareholders to rights holders. So you can join that session through the main platform again by clicking join session at that time. Again, just thank you to all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion and all of the attendees today as well. We hope to see you soon, and if you need any more information about this or anything else WDI related, please do get in touch. So thank you very much. Enjoy lunch, and I will see you back here at 2 p.m. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.